An overhead press is a foundational movement pattern that we're going to continue to see different variations of the same movement pattern being an overhead press. It doesn't matter if we're going to use dumbbells, it doesn't matter if we're going to use a barbell. There are some foundational form cues to keep in mind and also some mistakes to try to avoid and be cognizant of. One of the biggest mistakes that I see when someone is doing an overhead press is they have their arms all the way out to their sides, okay? So if you'll notice here, my arms are in alignment with my person. It looks a little something like this from the front. It looks a little something like this from the back, okay? But regardless, our arms don't necessarily need to be far out wide. And that's mostly for those who are using dumbbells, because as you can see, when I'm using a barbell, my arms can't be out to the sides because the bar is preventing that from happening. But notice what position my hands and my arms are in when I'm using the barbell, because that's what we're going to try to emulate. So keeping that in mind, we take our position from all the way out to the side, elbows are flared, and now we kind of want to bring them a little bit forward in a scapular plane position. Our elbows are not narrow and our palms aren't facing each other. They're also not completely flared. They're halfway in between, a 45-degree angle. Similarly, elbows are not tucked, wrists are not facing each other, hands are not all the way out wide. We're somewhere in the middle. We're at about a 45-degree angle. It's important to understand that because that's what's called being in the scapular plane. And when you're in the scapular plane, number one, it's a much safer position to put external load on your shoulders and your rotator cuff. And number two, because you're in proper alignment, you're going to be able to lift with more force, with more strength, with more power, and therefore get more out of your overhead press. Something to keep in mind with an overhead press, when your weight is over your center of gravity, it makes sense that our lower back hyperextends, okay? So it's almost like your glutes come back and now your lumbar spine has that curvature. That's not necessarily a great position. We want our ribs stacked over our hips. So we want to make sure that we are bracing our core by tucking our pelvis, pretending like there's a string from pubic bone that's drawing up to the ceiling. Now we're bracing our core, we're tensing our abs, and we want to maintain this position so that when our weight is over our head, we are safely doing so. Now there's a couple of different foot positions that might produce just a little bit different power production. The first one is going to be a split stance, all right? So a split stance, your feet are just in a split position and your body is in the middle of your front and your back foot, all right? So your weight is evenly distributed among your front and your back foot. This is a great stance to be in for a push press, all right? You slightly bend those knees. You're not in a full lunge, but you slightly bend those knees so that when you stand up, that little jolt up helps you lift that weight over your head. But mostly speaking, we are gonna be here, okay? So this is your foundation. We want our center of gravity evenly distributed in between both legs, just like a split stance position, except for we're in this position. So if our feet are too narrow, that foundation is going to be compromised. It's going to make our hips be a little bit more unstable, and therefore we're going to have to really focus on bracing ourselves at the top, and we're losing control of that lift. That lift is now in control of us, when really, remember, one of our focus points is to stay in control of that lift. We don't necessarily have to take our feet too wide unless this really makes you feel good and strong. Really, we're just looking for feet to be hip distance. And in doing so, with our feet hip distance, we're able to have a lot more force because our center of gravity is evenly distributed alongside our core is braced, and therefore we have that force production. We might take a shoulder press standing. We might take a shoulder press sitting. Standing position is going to require a little bit more core engagement, whereas a seated position is almost going to eliminate the need for a lot of core engagement, so you can really just focus on that overhead lift. Both are valuable in their own ways. In the different variations of a seated shoulder press, you might see me say a 45-degree angle with your bench or a 65-degree angle with your bench. A 45-degree angle is going to target a little bit more shoulders and chest, and a 65-degree angle is going to target more of your front delts. Versus a completely vertical 90-degree angle is focusing more on total body overhead pressing. It's not that the total body overhead pressing doesn't target shoulders, Your shoulders are what's working. Your shoulders are what's moving that bar or those dumbbells over your head. It's just simply different variations. So let's do it in practice together, starting with our setup, because our setup is either going to make or break us. Our feet are hip distance. We're going to tuck that pelvis forward. We're raising that weight over our head and we're lowering it down, noticing we remain in that scapular plane. Now, when we're using a barbell, it's really easy to let that barbell rock backward and therefore hyperextend your wrist. We're of course going to try to prevent that as much as possible. Because if we're hyperextending our wrist, we're stretching our wrist past its range of motion and we don't want to have wrist issues. So a helpful rule of thumb is going to be roll your wrist forward so that bar is resting in between your thumb and the palm of your hand. And now we can just continue with our normal form cues. Feet are hip distance. We're going to tuck our pelvis forward, bracing that core. Our arms are already in the scapular plane because we're using a barbell that naturally allows for that. We're going to raise that bar over our head and we're going to lower that bar. And that's overhead press 101.